So just to let you know, they're savvy about you. They were writing each other an email about this announcement, and as some of us are prone to do occasionally, I was on that email chain and they didn't realize that. And what they said was, we will have to inhale a lot of helium before we come up and make our announcement this morning. So they know about your reactions. Dr. Boyd now has planned a meaningful program. As many of you know, this is the 100-year anniversary of World War I. And so this morning's program is a nod to that history and this commemoration. Join me in welcoming Dr. Boyd.
Good morning. As Mr. Joy just mentioned, this year marks the centenary of the ceasefire that ended World War I at 11 a.m. on November the 11th, 1918. And many of you may also know this is the date of the ceasefire that explains why we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th of each year. And so to recognize this occasion, we've put together a program for the Assembly this morning that's designed to do three things. First, to allow us as a school to honor and remember those in our families and in the schools past who have served in the armed services. Second, to remember particularly the legacy of the First World War. And finally, to encourage us all to think about how, even though it is an event almost entirely outside of living memory, some of its legacies are so universal that we would do well to remember them today and in the future. There'll be two elements to this program, one focusing on the beginning of the war in 1914 and the other on its end 4 years later. In each case, there'll be a piece of music from the time being performed by MBA students and faculty, accompanying images of veterans from the MBA communities past and present. In this way, we hope this morning will provide a symbolic but meaningful link between our world today and the memory of the world of 1914 to 1918. Mr. Kelly is going to start things off by introducing the music that the Ellington Band will perform and by talking about how it speaks to the feelings about the war that existed as it began. As he is speaking, you will see images of young men at the moment of their enlistment in 1914. As the Ellington Band plays, you will see a montage of images of members of the MBA community from the last 50 years taken at their own enlistment or on deployment. And the poppies that the band are wearing are a traditional symbol of remembrance for those who lost their lives in World War I. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kelly.
Thanks, Dr. Boyd. Good morning. The two songs that you will hear in a few minutes involve an Irish connection. The first one is a song called Over There, and it is a song written in honour of the USA's 1917 decision to join the war on the British and French side. George M. Cohen was the writer of the song. Cohen was the son of Irish Catholic parents whose names were actually Kehan. Their son George, who was trying to make it in a music business dominated at the turn of the last century by Jewish music publishers, lyricists and performers, changed his name to the more Jewish-sounding Cohen and found success in the music business thereafter. Equally, Jewish people, on the other hand, found it difficult to break into the boxing scene. And so the Shears and the Rudolphs, following the example of the Irish, changed their names to O'Reilly and Sharkey in order to be accepted in the fight game. The second song, It's a Long Way to Tipperary, references a county in Ireland, Tipperary, where I was born. The song was written as a music hall song in 1912, 2 years before the outbreak of World War I. One of the reasons for its popularity during the war might be explained by the fact that there was a military convalescence hospital in Tipperary. Ireland was politically part of the British Empire until 1922. Injured soldiers would be shipped out of the trenches back to Tipperary to be treated for their wounds and later sent back to the war once they had recovered. Soldiers in the trenches sang these songs, longing for the hospital comforts of rural Ireland as they contended with bombs, bullets and barbed wire in that monumental military horror known as the Great War. Informatively, both It's a Long Way to Tipperary and another equally famous World War I song, Keep the Home Fires Burning, they memorize, rather than espouse or memorialize glorious military deeds, they echoed the soldiers' longing for home. Perhaps this theme of dreaming of home while far away at war owes its origins to the composition of the British Army in 1915. At the outbreak of the war, the British Army comprised 400,000 troops across 3 continents. By the end of the war, in 1918, the British forces numbered nearly 4 million combatants, 210,000 of which were Irish volunteers. Some 700,000 members of the British forces died in World War I, and 35,000 of those were volunteer Irishmen. All of these men on both sides of no man's land, there was no right side in this war, Englishmen, Welsh, American, German, French, drawn from all walks of life, had different reasons for joining the war effort. Some joined for the adventure of war, some for economic reasons, some for an ideal. Idealism is often mixed up with art, and one can argue that art doesn't change anything, but rather is a response to change. However, many critics and historians believe that one idealistic poem written in 1914 may well have helped hurl hundreds of thousands of men into the ranks of the British Army from 1915 onwards. This poem is called The Soldier, and was written in 1914 by Rupert Brooke, the son of an independent school housemaster. The school was Rugby. The poem is representative, as indeed Brooke is, of that patriotic, nationalistic, and spiritual sentiment prominent, not only in pre-World War I Britain, but also in many countries across Europe in the years leading up to the war. Historians suggest that this widespread prevalence of a kind of naive idealism led to the slaughter of a generation. At the beginning of the war, Brooke, who was wealthy, handsome, and clever, volunteered and was commissioned into the Royal Naval Division and took part in the disastrous Antwerp expedition in October 1914. In February 1915, he set sail from Egypt to the Dardanelles, which would feature later the Battle of Gallipoli. On board ship, he developed blood poisoning from a mosquito bite, and he died on the 23rd of April 1915 on a hospital ship off the Greek island of Skyros, and was buried in an olive grove on the island. The poem, which I will read in a second, the poem was recited from the pulpit at St. Paul's Cathedral on Easter Sunday, 1915, and published in the London Times the following day. Between April 4th and September 12th, nearly 500,000 men volunteered for the British Army, and by the end of September 2015, 2 million had signed up. So the poem, which I think is up there, it is a sonnet, and that form of poetry has come to be very much associated with England and the English, with the Shakespearean sonnet and others. You will also notice in the poem that England, or the word England or English, is mentioned 5 times, and the poem suggests that the death of a foreign soldier in a foreign land will make the earth of that land richer, and also it expresses the idea of sacrifice, or renewal, or the renewal associated with the sacrifice would make, even for a better heaven, an English heaven. So, The Soldier by Rupert Brooke. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. And think this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. By the end of July 1916, that idealistic sentiment expressed in Brooke's poem had all but evaporated among the general population. 1918 or 2018, the passing years bring new challenges. Men and women join the armed services of the respective countries for various reasons. For country, for a sense of justice, for adventure. The World War I poet Tom Kettle, in a poem to his daughter, declared that he joined the war and would die not for flag, nor king, nor emperor, but for a dream born in a herdsman's shed and for the secret scripture of the poor. Such idealism, guided by mercy, justice and love, has and always will have an important place in the services of the USA.
From 1897 has become the mantra for Veterans Day ceremonies all around the world. It speaks to an aspect of the occasion that can be often as emotionally poignant as it is necessary. Paying tribute to those who served or who are no longer with us or who served at times that few of us can anymore remember. For as well as celebrating the spirit of service that Mr. Kelly spoke of a few moments ago, November the 11th is also about remembering the losses that such service inevitably brings with it. The immediate relevance of the First World War to today can seem unclear. The societies the soldiers came from, the lives they lived, the causes they believed in were all very different. And yet I would argue that the First World War speaks to certain universal truths about what it means to serve, to fight, and in particular what it means to grapple with the inevitable tragedies that warfare can bring to soldiers and civilians alike. Truths that we cannot afford to forget, both for the sake of understanding the reality of war and also in order to properly honor the memories of those who didn't make it home. The degree of loss suffered during the First World War can be hard to imagine, and we should be grateful that it is. About 18 million people lost their lives during the conflict, but as a statistic, that number is almost too vast to comprehend. A more tangible way of understanding it is to look at the contrast between two photos of the same battalion taken 2 years apart. At the top of the screen, you see a battalion of the Cameron Highlanders ready to go to the Western Front at the beginning of the war in 1914. The bottom photograph shows the remaining survivors of that battalion, taken at the end of the war in November of 1918. The world these soldiers fought and died in 100 years ago can also seem completely alien to us, but again I would argue there is a certain universality of experience for a young man or woman going off to war that transcends time and place. Not only that, but from your standpoint as students, there is a broader generational link with the soldiers of the First World War. Consider the case of two soldiers in particular whose deaths bookend the start and end of the fighting. First, John Parr, a British soldier born in Crouch End, London, barely a mile from where I grew up. So caught up was he in the atmosphere of August 1914 that Mr. Kelly described that he lied about his age in order to enlist. Just days after reaching the front, he was killed the first time he drew his weapon, becoming the first British soldier to die in the conflict. Second, Henry Gunther, an American soldier from Baltimore, born to German immigrant parents. With the clock ticking down to the start of the ceasefire at 11 a.m., officers on all sides continued to give orders to attack. Even with German soldiers calling out to him to wait just a few more moments for the war to be over, Gunther charged at a machine gun nest and was killed at 10:59 a.m., becoming the last soldier to die on the Western Front. Alex Ray and William Wheeler, would you both stand up for a moment? On the day that he was killed, John Parr was exactly the age that Alex is today. On the day the war began, Henry Gunther was exactly the age that William is today. It was young men at precisely the stage in their lives that you are now who formed the original generation of soldiers that Veteran Day remembers. And it is young men and women precisely like you today who will form the next generation of veterans we remember in the future. The experiences of each such generation may be distinct, but we should not overlook the common threads that run through them. Thank you both. In closing, it's a combination of the scale of the sacrifice and the individual stories it represents that makes it particularly important for us to remember the legacy of World War I. Just as it is these ever-same features of warfare and loss that we should remember each and every time at this year. Because whether you fell on the Western Front 100 years ago, or in Iraq or Afghanistan in 2018, our message should be the same. You will be remembered. It matters not if you died in an act of selfless heroism, having successfully called on that last full measure of devotion, or if you died alone and terrified, lost and helpless in a shell's crater in no man's land. It matters not if you died as a volunteer or a conscript, as an officer or a private. And it matters not if you died in the last act of a war or at its very outset. You will be remembered. To close out this program, the MBA choir will now sing the hymn, Abide With Me, a piece that is regularly played at Veterans Day ceremonies around the world and has long been associated with the memory of World War I in particular. It has been described as a plea for spiritual guidance when surrounded by grief and loss, as indeed the world was at the time of the ceasefire in 1918. As they sing, you will see a montage of veterans from the MBA community who fought in conflicts now distant in our memory, who are no longer with us, or who died in those conflicts. And as we pay tribute to them, I hope you will also take away from this morning that if anyone ever asks you about the First World War or about Veterans Day, why should we remember? You will know the answer is very simple: lest we forget.